Much anticipated blitz match between notorious American Grandmaster Hans Niemann and Russian Grandmaster Daniil Dubov was held in Moscow. Dubov, 28 years old, rated 2795, sixth best blitz player in the world. Niemann, 21 years old, rated 2734, 16th best blitz player in the world. A little history. During the World Championship held last year in New York, Dubov did not show up for the game against Nieman, and although the official version was Dubov overslept, it was pretty clear it was a protest, as many chess players, including Dubov, consider Hans Niemann a cheater. What's at stake for this game, for this match? 18 games, standard blitz time control, 3 minutes each with 2 seconds added for each move, $2,000 per game. More importantly, the loser of the match will be subject to a lie detector test. I want to show you the best games of the first day. In game number 4, Dubov was playing white and Niemann was playing black. Dubov started with c4, which is an English opening. We'll go quickly over the opening moves. They're all theory: knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight f3, knight c6, e3, bishop e7, a3, short castle. Dubov plays queen c2, Niemann rook e8, and Dubov starts an attack on the queen side of the board with b4. Bishop f8, retreating the bishop on f8 square, bishop d3, and here comes the sacrifice of the bishop from Niemann. Bishop takes b4. And now if Dubov takes the bishop, knight would take the bishop on b4 with the fork to the queen and the bishop. If the queen goes away, knight takes the bishop, queen takes d3, and e4 with the fork. So that was the plan. Dubov saw it and didn't take the bishop on b4, instead played knight g5, which is also not the best move, but at least it creates an attack on the pawn on h7. Niemann takes the knight on c3, and Dubov takes the pawn on h7 with the check. King goes to f8. Obviously, you don't want to take the bishop with the knight, because the queen will penetrate to the black camp with a very devastating attack. King goes to f8, pawn takes on c3, knight takes h7, knight takes h7 check, king g8, h4, trying to get the pawn to h6 and open the file for the rook. Here comes e4, blocking the diagonal, and now the knight on h7 is under attack. Knight has to go back to g5, d6, and here if Dubov takes the pawn on e4, then it would be met by bishop f5 and pinning the knight, which would be a devastating pin. And therefore Dubov plays f3, trying to again open the diagonal for the queen. So obviously you cannot take the pawn on f3, but Niemann plays a beautiful move f6, knocking out the knight from g5, and now after knight takes e4, bishop f5, the knight is pinned, and after h5, queen e7, putting more pressure on the knight on e4, h6, bishop takes e4, f takes e4, queen takes e4. Look at those ugly pawns for Dubov. On a3, c3, c4, we have an isolated pawn on a3, we have an isolated pawn on e3, we have an isolated pawn on g2, we have double isolated pawns on c3 and c4. Every endgame here is gonna be won easily by black. So white cannot exchange the queens and play queen d2. Niemann grabs the pawn on c4. Dubov creates some counterplay on the b file, attacking the pawn on b7. Niemann protects the pawn with b6. H takes g7, opening the file for the rook, but simply king takes g7, and no threats to the king, although it's open. Queen f2, and now white would like to start some attack with the move queen g3 check, but here comes rook h8, trying to get control of the h file for Niemann. Rook goes to f1, the pawn on f6 is under attack with potential checkmate, so therefore rook h6, excellent move protecting the pawn on f6, queen g3 check, and rook blocks the king with rook g6. Here black's position is absolutely winning. White king is in the center of the board. White pawns are totally isolated. The bishop on c1 is absolutely sad piece that didn't even start the game and probably will not be able to get into the game. Queen h3, possibly to penetrate into the black position with queen d7, but knight e5, not only centralizing the knight, but also protecting the square d7 from any infiltration to their position. Rook h1, with the idea to penetrate into the black position with queen h7 check, but the king just moves away to f7, queen f5, doubling up the rooks for Niemann on g file, attacking the pawn on g2. Bishop finally gets into the game, bishop d2, but here comes rook g takes g2 with the checkmate threats on e2, check on h7, rook g7 blocking the check, queen h5 check, king e7, and in this position white resigns as Niemann, playing black, has too many threats. His position is totally dominating, plus he has two extra pawns with the threats of rook g1, knight d3 check, and the queen, if the queen moves away, then queen e2 checkmate. So this position is totally lost. Dubov resigned. This is game number 6, possibly the best game, at least of the first day of the match. Another English opening from Dubov, c4, e5, knight c3, bishop e7, e3, f5. That's an aggressive start of the game by Niemann. d4 immediately challenging black center, d6 protecting the pawn on e5, bishop d3 developing the bishop, knight jumps to f6, white knight develops on e2, short castle for Niemann, b3. Again, I'm going quickly with the opening moves because they are all theory and nothing to see here. c6, f3, bishop e6, bishop b2. Almost all the pieces are in the game after knight d7, queen c2. White are still thinking whether to castle short or long. g6, protecting the pawn on f5, it was under attack by this battery. h4, immediately starting attack on the king side of the board and hinting that Dubov would like to castle long side. Queen a5, pinning the knight on c3, a3 with the possibility of playing b4 in the future, rook goes to e8, and we have a long castle, and that would mean great things for chess fans because we're gonna see white attacking on the king side of the board, black attacking on the queen side of the board, and in a couple of moves there would be a total mayhem on the board. After b5, Niemann immediately starts challenging white's position on the queen side. Dubov does the same on the king side, but he is too late. Black's attack is much quicker. Exchanging the pawns on c4, beautiful move e4, because now the bishop is trapped. You have to take the pawn on e4, but now black do not take the pawn on e4. Instead, they take the pawn on g4 and attacking the pawn on e3 with the knight and the forking the queen and the rook. d5, counterattack by Dubov attacking the bishop, but Niemann sacrifices the bishop by playing knight c5. And here, very interesting variation. If white takes the bishop on e6, then knight takes e3, fork. And now if queen goes to b1, then beautiful knight checkmate, knight b3. And if queen goes to d2, then knight b3, fork and winning the queen. Therefore, in this position, Dubov plays knight d4, counterattacking the bishop with the knight. Knight takes e3, forking the rook and the queen. Queen moves away to e2. Bishop f6, the bishop on e6 is still under attack, but bishop f6 attacking. The knight on d4, absolute chaos on the board. e5, Dubov uses the last resort to continue some resistance, although his position is totally lost here and computer shows -4 for white. Bishop takes e5 and knight takes c6, forking the queen and the bishop. Absolute monster bishop on e5, so it makes sense to exchange it for a knight. Queen retreats to b6, knight takes on e5, but knight takes the rook on d1. So many pieces are under attack, it's impossible to count. Pretty much everything is under attack. Queen takes d1, pawn takes e5, and pawn takes e6. So let's take a breather here and count the material. And the material is black has 5 pawns, white has 4 pawns, so 1 extra pawn, and white has 2 pieces for a rook. So the material is even, but black position is totally winning after the move rook b8, attacking the bishop on b2. Hans Niemann does not find this move. He plays knight takes d3, loses all his advantage. This position is already even. Queen takes e6, black has an extra pawn, but again, their position is at least not better at this point, because knight jumps to d5, very active square, and after f4, h5, and white would like to open the rook on h-file, take the pawn on g6, therefore queen f5, blocking all these ideas. Queen goes to b3 and g5, and black are marching with 3 connected pawns to the queen. White has only 1 passing pawn, but it's very dangerous as well. After c5, we have some discovery attacks going on here, so the king has to retreat to h8, rook goes to e1, and the pawn continues to march forward with f3. Knight this e3 hitting the queen, f2 cannot take the queen, because after f take e1, the pawn will become a queen and take the rook in the meantime. Rook goes to f1, queen e4, not the best move in this position. The best move in this position was actually queen f3 to have the knight pinned, but queen e4, queen c3, another big mistake by Dubov, and here the winning move is rook f3, and Niemann finds it. The knight is pinned. White have no chances. They play king d2, protecting the knight on e3, continuing the game, waiting for a mistake, and mistake happens. Niemann, again, reminder, it's a blitz game, and both opponents have seconds on the clock. He blunders a shot on e5. So queen takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop takes e5, check, and taking a rook. But wait a minute, Dubov, playing white, did not see it. And in a time scramble, he plays bishop a1. And here, Niemann is easily winning with, for example, the move rook takes e3. Rook takes e3, queen takes e3, rook d8, king e2, queen c2, king f3, rook d3, and the queen is trapped. So that was the win. Niemann didn't find it, makes another mistake, and plays a rook f4. again allowing white to take on e5 from the second attempt. Dubov sees it, takes on e5, queen takes e5. That was a check, by the way, so queen takes e5, bishop takes e5 with the check, king has to go away, and bishop takes b8. Niemann resigned because white has 2 extra pieces and a passing pawn, so white's position is totally winning. Devastating loss by Nieman in an absolutely winning position. And finally, in game 8, I just want to show you the finish of the game because it's a very instructional endgame played by Dubov. So let's take a look at this position. White, Dubov playing white. He has 2 rooks against a rook and a knight, and 3 pawns against 4. So he has a material advantage, but the way he converts this position into a win is very instructional. Nieman plays knight f6, attacking the rook. Dubov sacrifices the rook by playing rook c7, but he has a plan. Knight takes h7, Dubov takes the knight on h7, and this position is winning because of one trick. Rook goes to e6, rook h8 check. In this position, black resigned. Why did they resign? Obviously, if you block the king, the black king is not on time to prevent white pawn from promoting. So the king has to step away. Let's say it goes to c7. The winning move is h7 in this position. And now let's say rook h6. And here you cannot check and give up the rook because the black rook protects the promotion square of h8. But the winning move is rook a8. And what happens now? The next move, white promotes to a queen. But wait, black can take the pawn. Yes, they can. But rook a7. Skewer attack on the rook. King has to move away, and rook takes h7. That's the way Dubov could win this endgame. So Nieman resigned ahead of time. And after the first day, after 9 games, Dubov is leading Hans Niemann 5.5 points to 3.5 points. And 9 more games are gonna play the next day.